In the beginning, I'm going to introduce Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard. She is a highly regarded social worker, educator, researcher, community activist, and advocate of social change. She has worked in mental health at the provincial level, in rural community practice at the municipal level, and since 1990 as a professor at the Dalhousie School of Social Work, where she also served as director for a decade. In 2016, she was appointed Special Advisor on Diversity and Inclusiveness at Dalhousie University, and she is the first African Nova Scotian to hold a tenure-track position at Dalhousie University and to be promoted to full professor. Dr. Thomas Bernard has worked with provincial organizations to bring diversity to the political processes in Nova Scotia and teach community members about Canada's legislative process and citizen engagement. She's a founding member of the Association of Black Social Workers, which helps address the needs of marginalized citizens, especially those of African descent. As a former member of the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women, and as its past chair, was instrumental in the development of advice to ministers regarding frameworks for gender violence prevention and health equity. At the national level, she has served as a member of the National Coalition of Advisory Councils on the Status of Women. She has served as an expert witness in human rights cases and has presented at many local, national, and international forums. Dr. Thomas Bernard has received many honors for her work and community leadership, notably the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada. We are excited to have Senator Bernard with us today, and will be followed with youth perspectives on racism from young people of Shiloh Center for Multicultural Roots.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me say thank you to the Shiloh Center for Multicultural Roots for inviting me to be with you here today at this really, really important conference. I'm so delighted that you've decided to mark the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by having this conference, Ignite Change. I do have a PowerPoint, and they're going to pull that up in a second for me. While they're doing that, I'll just let you know that I'm joining you from my home in Nova Scotia. I'm grateful to live on Mi'kmaq territory. I acknowledge the work of the Mi'kmaq and also the work of the Mi'kmaq with welcoming other communities, including mine. I live in the community of East Preston, which is one of the Black Loyalist communities that was settled back in the 1700s. It's when I feel the spirit of the ancestors every day that I have the privilege of being here on this land. So as I said, I do have a PowerPoint, but it seems to be a little struggle in terms of finding the PowerPoint. That's okay. I will get started anyway, because I can start without the slides. When I was invited to join you today, oh, we found it, okay. I think we want to go to the slideshow view, I think. So the theme, Ignite Change, is so incredibly important. And when I think about igniting change, and I think about where we are right now, so 75 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 75 years of marking International Human Rights Day, 75 years of fighting for change, 75 years of leaders igniting change. I think it's very timely that we're talking about this today. It was wonderful to hear your opening. I think that was Renee who was speaking at the beginning. It was wonderful to hear Mayor Sohi, to hear about some of the work you're doing in Edmonton. I haven't been to Edmonton in some time, but I'll tell you, I've heard about the Shiloh Baptist Church. I know about Amber Valley, but I've never had the opportunity to visit. So maybe this will be a year that I change that. We'll go to the next slide, please. So my plan is to talk with you a little bit about my journey to the Senate, a place where we are expected to make change happen. I'll talk briefly about the role of senators, but then I want to really focus on creating social change and how we do that, and creating braver spaces. And I'm hoping that we have a bit of time at the end for a Q&A if there's an opportunity to do that. We'll go on to the next slide, please. So when I think about my journey to the Senate, one of the things that I'm reminded of is the fact that I was never expected to be there. That's me sitting on the chair. And that's my 18-month-old self. My 3-year-old sister standing beside me, and we're standing in our yard. We grew up in absolute poverty. Then when I was 12 and my sister Valerie was 14, our father was killed in a tragic car accident. Our mom was left to raise 10 children on her own, 2 grandchildren. And Valerie and I stepped up to help mom because the youngest was only 18 months old. And so there was so much trauma, so much poverty, so many struggles. But we survived. And the fact that we survived is largely due to the reality that people stepped in to help us. Why did people help us? People helped us because we were seen as deserving poor. And I think, unfortunately, we live in a country where we divide people into deserving and undeserving poor. And because my mom was a widow, because of that very tragic death of my dad, we were seen as deserving poor. We were poor before our father died, but we wouldn't have been seen as deserving poor at that time. And so I don't have time to go into depth with that conversation, just to say that as a member of the deserving poor in Nova Scotia, as an African Nova Scotian, I'm a person who benefited from the struggles of anti-Black racism and the struggle to fight for rights and to fight for opportunities. And my sister and I and one of our cousins, we were the first people from the community to go off to university and to graduate. I went into social work. And long story short, that journey to the Senate was not a journey that was planned, was not a journey that was predestined, but as a journey that I'm very grateful to have been on. And every day I get to bring the voices of marginalized people into the Senate because I know what it's like to live on the margins, because I have indeed lived on the margins. Thank you. We'll go to the next slide. So the work in the Senate, there's a lot of advocacy work. There's a lot of community connections. I do try to connect with Black communities across the country. I do try to address schools and young people. And as a social worker, I try to engage with social workers, again, across the country. A lot of our work is done through committees and associations. I'm the vice chair of the Senate Committee on Human Rights. And I'm also on the Senate Social Affairs Committee. So as you can imagine, those 2 committees deal with a lot of social issues that are, in fact, human rights issues. I'm a founding member of the African Canadian Senate Group. I'm an executive team member of the Progressive Senate Group. I really try to advocate around issues of racial justice, around issues of disability and ableism, and around mental health. Those are the core areas. But in everything that I do, I try to do it with a race equity lens and also an intersectional lens, because our intersectionality is important as well. And one of the things about the work in the Senate, every bill that becomes law in Canada has to pass both the Senate and the House of Commons before it can go on to royal assent. And so engaging in that work every single day is the core. When I think about what is it that I bring to that work. I would say that my commitment to human rights, my commitment to race equity, my commitment to addressing intersectionality and bringing that lens into the work, my commitment to employment equity, and my commitment to social change and social justice is what I try to bring to my work in the Senate. We'll go to the next slide, please. So why and how am I able to do all of that? I would say I'm able to do that because of my social location as an African Nova Scotian woman, who now lives with an invisible disability, as an African Nova Scotian woman who lives with some power by virtue of the position that I hold. But I also experience racism and sexism and other forms of oppression, ableism. I experience all of those things. And so one of the things that I think is important as we're thinking about human rights and igniting change, we each of us needs to do that by understanding first our social location. That's the important, critical first step in doing this work. Understanding what power you hold, also understanding what privilege you hold, understanding oppression, understanding marginalization, understanding those intersections, and understanding the compounding nature of the intersectionality with the structural barriers that we face. That's how we ignite social change, by beginning from ourselves, by doing that self-reflection, understanding our own power and privilege. Even though we spend so much time, I think, understanding the oppression, and those of us who live with race oppression, that's we're always on board with that, because there's an everydayness to that racism. But we also need to understand that and unpack that from an intersectional lens, and then use that to ignite change. We'll go to the next slide, please. The other thing we have to do is understand and identify the levels where change can happen. So if we think about power and the power you have, think about what power you have at a personal level to affect change. We all have a sphere of influence personally. So how do we use that to affect change? We can think about the power and privilege that we hold at the professional level. How can we use power and privilege to affect change at that professional level? That's one of the reasons why I joined with 3 other women back in 1979, almost 45 years ago, to form the Association of Black Social Workers, because we knew that together, professionally, we had more power as 4 of us working together than any of us working on our own. So looking at how we can leverage power and leverage privilege. And then thinking about that in the context of policy, not just policy development, but also policy implementation. So again, how does our social location influence even the way we interpret policy? For those of us who are developing policies, how does our power and privilege impact the way we develop policy? And then implementing the policies. How are we doing that? And how does our social location impact and influence that? And then my 4th P, so I call these the 4 Ps. My 4th P is political. How do you leverage power and privilege? How do you share power and privilege in the political spaces? And so one of the ways, of course, is running for office and being elected. So we just heard from Mayor Sohi, and Mayor Sohi underscored so many examples of the work that they're doing. And I would imagine a lot of that work under his leadership is him using the power and privilege from his position as a racialized person in that political space. How do you use that? But we need to think about the political space a bit more broadly as well. So think about it not just in terms of running for office, but think about it in terms of supporting people who are running for office. Think about it as asking the right questions to those who are running. Think about it as just being politically aware. Think about it as simply as voting. You know, some of us didn't have the right to vote when Canada became a country. Women, for example, didn't have the right to vote. Women weren't considered persons. Indigenous people weren't considered persons. People of African descent. How can it be if my ancestors have been in Nova Scotia since the 1700s? How can it be that I'm only the first African Nova Scotian woman to be appointed to the Senate, and only the third African Nova Scotian ever appointed to the Senate? There's something wrong with that. And so we need to be constantly thinking about where we can ignite change in each one of these levels. It's our responsibility to do that. If we want to make things better, if we want to ignite change for the next generation, that's part of how we do it. We'll go to the next slide, please. So how do we create change? How do we create change in our communities? I think one of the ways is through positive disruption. Let's not just maintain the status quo. Let's disrupt, but let's disrupt in a way where our integrity is intact. Let's disrupt in a way. Martin Luther King talked about peaceful change and peaceful dialogue. Let's use use the power and privilege for positive disruption, disrupting the status quo. Critical reflection. So I started earlier with that whole idea of that critical reflection, reflecting on who I am, where I am, what's my social location, and what's my responsibility. Think about it. Everyone who's listening to this talk this morning, think about your responsibility. What is your responsibility to lead change? Gandhi said, be the change. But I say, let's lead the change. If we all think about ourselves and see ourselves as leaders in our spaces. And I'm not talking about people in leadership positions. I'm talking about people who have the passion to lead change. I'm talking about people who have the determination to lead change. Let's see ourselves as leaders in this space, in these spaces. Let's lead the change you want to see. I think that's what the Shiloh Center for Multicultural Roots is all about. You've come together because you want to lead change. It's a wonderful example. We'll go to the next slide, please. Part of how we do that, I think, is by creating braver spaces. Some of us are not willing to act, not willing to speak out, not willing to challenge the status quo unless there are safe spaces. And if you take nothing else from this talk, take this one thing. There's no such thing as a safe space. But I think we can look for braver spaces. So braver spaces recognize the power dynamics based on that slide I showed earlier about that intersectionality. So we recognize the power dynamics. And for many of us, there's no safe space. But when you thinking about 75 years, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, thinking about the ongoing fight for rights, thinking about things that are going on in the world today and in this country today, I want to remind us all that it takes a lot of courage to address those issues. It takes a lot of courage to be brave enough to take a stand against racism, to take a stand against sexism, to take a stand against discrimination. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And we need to find that brave center within ourselves and in our communities and in our families so that we can lead the change we want to see. we can create anti-racist environments. Mayor Sohi talked about 130 recommendations. That sounds to me like a complete overhaul of systems. And that's amazing that there's commitment to do that. That's creating anti-racist environment. That's finding the courage to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. We'll go to the next slide, please. One of the ways, or one of the things that drives braver spaces is critical hope. And given all the things that are going on around the country and around the world today, given all of the abuses of human rights everywhere, it's hard to find and maintain hope. Yet it's that critical hope that will drive change. So let's find that critical hope and let's hold on to it. Critical hope is really about hopeful actions based on your analysis of whatever situation you're in. Critical hope is about being an agent for change on a human rights agenda. Critical hope is about finding strength in a realistic optimism I have here, but understanding the broader context in which you're trying to lead change, and then finding strength in that. So your critical analysis of what's going on, and then you find a way in. And I always say, if you can't find a way in through a door, maybe it's a window, but find a way in. It's really about leading the change we want to see. So we can lead the change we want to see in our personal lives. We can lead the change we want to see in our organizations. We can lead the change we want to see in our provinces, in our cities, in our towns. We can lead the change we want to see in our communities. And the specifics of that may look and will look different for every person and in every situation. But the most important thing you need to hold on to is that critical hope that the actions you take matter. And silence matters. So let's not be silent. We'll go to the next slide. So what are 3 key things I want you to take from this talk? I want you to allow critical hope to continue to drive your work on those days that it feels like you just can't keep going anymore. Remember, find that injection of critical hope. I want to invite you to make the shifts. Think about anti-oppression and anti-discrimination, and think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and think about the community that you want to see 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or in the next 75 years. And finally, I want to remind you that change, for as much as we know that change is a collective responsibility, we also need to be reminded of the fact that there's also some individual responsibility required. We all have a role to play in advocating for human rights. We all have a role to play in making our world a little better. And we all have a responsibility to leave this world better for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Bernard, for that insightful and inspirational session. Before we hear the reflections from the Shiloh panelists, I'd like to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. So can we start with you, Shelley?
Thank you. My name is Shelley Ogilvie Murphy. I'm a second-generation Canadian. My dad was born in Amber Valley, which is 170 kilometers east of Edmonton. It's one of the first Black settlements in the Western Canada. There's 5 different settlements: Breton, Wildwood, Amber Valley, Camp C, and Maidstone, Saskatchewan. My great-grandpa Jordan Murphy was one of the scouts that came up from Oklahoma, and he came with Mr. Sneed, and they scouted out the area, and then went back to Oklahoma and brought up some of the family, and then settled in Amber Valley. In 2001, there was a stamp honoring Amber Valley and showing my grandpa, a cousin, and an aunt, and my grandpa on the stamp, honoring Amber Valley, one of the first settlements.
Hi, my name is Darrell Byron. I was born and raised in Edmonton. I am half Vincentian and half Barbadian. I grew up actually in this church here. It is a predominantly Black historical church, Shiloh Baptist Church. I also participate in the youth group here as well as community outreach. In terms of myself, I have been someone who's followed in my mother's footsteps in terms of healthcare. She was a psychiatric nurse. I am now a combined lab and X-ray tech. My father is a pastor actually at this church, and a lot of my influence has come from that healthcare profession in attempts to show the ability to have Black figures in healthcare in predominant spaces doing healthcare every day. I have a degree at University of Alberta in biological sciences, and then I got my certificate for combined lab and X-ray tech at NAIT. Outside of that, I'm an avid basketball player, a reader. I like to write quite a bit, and really I like to speak on empowerment as much as I can for anyone who's willing to listen. So thank you.
Good morning. My name is Trinity Middleton Ryan. I'm 27 years old. I'm a Canadian African American mix. Also a single mother of 3 boys, ages 5, 3, and 2. My father is from Muskogee, Oklahoma, and my mother is from St. Boniface, Manitoba. I was born here in Edmonton, and I also... Check. Do I restart? Okay. My name is Trinity Middleton Ryan. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a Canadian African American mix, a single mother of 3 boys, ages 5, 3, and 2. My father is from Muskogee, Oklahoma, and my mother is from St. Boniface, Manitoba. I was born here in Edmonton, and I also grew up in Shiloh Baptist. I am bilingual, speaking English and French. I have graduated from hair school and makeup artistry, and most recently business administration at Macamee College. I'm now currently enrolled at Macamee College for master instructor with hopes of creating a program along SCMR providing information of the Black Canadian history.
To start off our Q&A, I'd just like to give some thoughts and insight on what you've spoken about, Senator. One thing that really struck me was when you spoke about braver spaces. I do have just some interaction, I guess, about that. I believe I really like the conversation about it just because it includes the fact that we don't truly have safe spaces. And I think that's been a big issue for Black people in general. I think often we come from a position where nowhere we believe is necessarily a safe space because we don't always feel represented in whatever we're doing. I think that does force us to have to use the ability to be brave. So I like the phrase using, or the choice of words being braver spaces, just so we can force ourselves to kind of put ourselves in that position. Although it could hurt us, it could benefit us just as much. I think that gives us some pride and some effort to actually see change in our futures. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, just in the sense of not being represented in your situation and knowing you have to be braver to kind of actually get to a position somewhere farther.
Yes, I definitely agree with your statement.
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you a question or not. I'm not too sure. But on that braver spaces topic, is there anything you would advise for someone of our age, like a younger person, in terms of being able to actually make that step to put yourself in a braver position, although it could backfire to some degree?
Thank you. That's a really good question, and I really like your reflections on it. One of the things that I would say is it's always really important to be strategic. So if you're in a job, for example, not that you have golden handcuffs in that job, but you don't want to get yourself fired, right? And so being strategic, having strategic conversations with people, maybe it's with coworkers, maybe it's with a supervisor to say, I was thinking about this and I'm not quite sure if I want to do it this way. Even that is being brave, when you can put these issues on the table, when it doesn't feel safe to do it. When your barometer says this doesn't feel safe, that's when you know you have to be brave. But for younger people, I would say, look, have the conversations. If you don't have a mentor in your field, find one. And mentors don't always have to look like us, right? Mentors can be people from other communities, including Caucasian people, who are in those spaces, who want to be an ally. They want to be an authentic ally. So I think, especially when we're the only one that looks like us in the space, then you have to reach out and find some allies and find some people, and maybe find someone that's willing to mentor you or sponsor you. Most older people, I'm realizing most older people really want to help the younger generation. So take advantage of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I did have another remark and question with that. You had a diagram. I don't remember one of the parts, but the top was political, and then there was a space, and then it was professional, and then personal. I just first want to speak on, I like the diagram just in the sense of it's encompassing personal being at the middle, in the sense of your personal understanding and attempts to outreach other people does affect on a political level, does affect on a professional level. I just enjoy that it does always come from within to actually be able to outreach somewhere else outside of yourself. I do ask the question. I know that personally, well, for me, I've always been able to kind of speak out, but for a lot of other people, it's a lot more difficult to just speak on anything that could have any type of negative backlash. I do just want to know if there's any advice you would give to someone who's maybe less brave to speak on such topics, if there's an easier way to break out of their shell to be able to speak on topics of oppression or of discrimination, any type of sort.
That's a really good question. I don't know if there's any easy way to break out of one's shell, but I can tell you how I did it. So let me say this. I used to be so shy, and essentially I'm introverted. And so I think shy, introverted people have a hard time finding their voice in those spaces. So I'm being very honest with you to say that I'm going to share with you what worked for me. I always travel with pen and paper. And even today, here I am with my pen and paper. Before I became more comfortable raising issues publicly, I used to write out everything I wanted to say before I said it. So that's one strategy. Write down what you want to say before you say it. Second strategy that has worked for me, I would say the second strategy that's really worked for me is being willing to be vulnerable. So when you're speaking and you're feeling nervous and frightened about that, you're vulnerable. So being willing to be vulnerable in public spaces, it's humbling, but it's also very empowering when you share something and people get it. When they get it, that's really powerful. I've had to deal with the gender issues as well, and as a woman in some spaces, so I'm dealing with that intersection of race and gender, and I was often the only person of African descent in the space, but not the only woman. And quite often what would happen, I'd say something and it would just sort of lay, it would fall and no one would pick it up. And then one of the men in the room, one of the white men in the room, would say what I said, maybe say it a little differently, maybe 5 minutes later, maybe 10 minutes later. And that used to make me furious. But then I decided, how are you helping yourself if you're furious and you're the only one that knows you're furious? So I decided I would use humor as a way of dealing with that. So my way of dealing with that would be to follow up what that person was saying by saying something like, you're absolutely right. And that's exactly what I said 10 minutes ago. Thank you for repeating it. I'm telling you, that worked. And the final thing that I did, it links with something I was just saying to you. Find allies. I used to do work in the early years. One of my co-workers was an out lesbian before it was really legal to be who you are, love who you want to love. And so she and I set up this strategy where I started speaking out about homophobia in those spaces. She's a white lesbian woman, and she would speak out about the race issues. So that sort of threw people off guard a bit because they were always expecting me to speak about race and always expecting her to speak about the homophobia. And when we flip-flopped it, it was like, oh, and people started to notice. And then we realized that the more we did that, the more other people started stepping up and taking some responsibility, because if I'm the only Black person in the room, I shouldn't be the only person in the room talking about racism. So trying to have those I would say that one of the most important things is having the difficult conversations and being willing to have the difficult conversations. And the final thing I will say around this question is self-care. And self-care looks different for everyone. But one of the things that was always important for me in terms of self-care was having someone that I could debrief things with, without filters. So someone that I could just say, you won't believe what happened today. And just, be able to talk about it. And I think that's, part of what I put in my self-care strategy. In addition to the personal things, we want to choose around self-care, but having someone, having someone in your circle, that's important. These are really good questions, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do have one last question I would like to ask, but kind of explain a bit. When I grew up in school, I was often the only Black person either in my class, sometimes even in my school. And when you see that, like if I'm being honest, I would say the reason I'm in healthcare is because I was able to see my own mother in a position where I was able to do that, which made me believe it was possible. But before that, certain things I didn't find as possible. Like when you look at where the predominant Black people that you see on television are, I know a lot of Black men who want to be a basketball player because they see it every day on television, right? But they may not see a nurse or a doctor or a lawyer, whoever it may be, any type of job. But on top of that, not just to feel put in a box there, but also in the sense of when I see on television, say a white person has done something negative, it's that one person. Versus when I see on television that, say, a Black man has murdered somebody, it counts for 1 million. And it puts you in a box where you feel like you can't break out of what one person's fault has done if your color of skin is Black. So my question to you is more so what helps you in your personal life keep the hope that not only you will see change, but that people can excel, Black people can excel to be at a level where they understand anything is possible for them?
One of the things, I think someone may have said this earlier, one of the things that that continues to give me that critical hope is always being mindful of the fact that I'm standing on the shoulders of our ancestors who did so much with so little. You're very fortunate that you had someone, your mom in your family, your mom, in healthcare was an inspiration for you to want to get into healthcare. And you're absolutely right. Not many of us have those persons in our immediate families. You're lucky when you do. So that's what gives me hope. That being reminded that I stand on the shoulders. And actually, I still do a little teaching, and a group of students gave me this plaque. I'm going to read it to you. And they gave me this plaque, and I put it on my desk. And it reads, "The ancestors are moving mountains to see you rise." Remember that. The ancestors are moving mountains to see you rise. And so for all of us, we're all standing on the shoulders of our ancestors. I think about, some of those ancestors who were part of that development of the Universal Declaration on the Human Rights. 75 years ago, these people made a decision that we were going to globally fight for human rights. We stand on their shoulders, and we owe it to them to keep going. That's where I get that strategic hope, is recognizing the shoulders. The other thing that I do, I have the privilege, as a senator, I have the privilege to go into schools, to go into universities, to go into colleges, to go into communities, and to talk. And I always, get a question about myself, my own journey. And one of the things that really gives me a lot of hope is actually what young people mirror back to you. When young people ask you really critical questions, when young people are genuinely interested in what you're doing, when young people, I had a young man recently email me to say, I've just moved from Vancouver to Nova Scotia. I don't know anyone, but I really want to reach out and do something here. What can I do? And I thought, wow, this is amazing. Yes, there's lots of places where you can be engaged and to do some work. And he reached out by email to me because I had done a talk in his class, and he wanted to follow up. So when those sorts of things happen, that gives me hope. So we all need to find out what we need for that critical hope. But and my hope is that everyone can find something.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions for you. I just want to quickly say just thank you for not only the presentation, but just seeing you in the position that you're in. I'm sure even for people just watching online gives a lot of hope for their futures, knowing that they can see somebody who looks just like them do what you're doing. So I just want to say thank you. I truly appreciate that.
Thank you very much. I think that there may be some questions from the audience, so I'm happy to stay on a bit longer. Oh, here's a good question. How do you address the school admin that calls you a disruptor because of speaking up, especially when you're the only Black individual in class? So here's two things I would suggest. Number one, find someone like-minded that supports where you're going with this. And I'll invite you to quote me. You can say, look, I heard a presentation from Senator Bernard, and she said one of the ways we lead change is by being a positive disruptor. So being a disruptor is not a bad thing. It's how you disrupt that becomes the issue. So as long as you're being a positive disruptor, you're doing something good. But have an ally, have a buddy. And if you don't have a buddy, talk to a parent or guardian. Let someone else know what you're doing so that they have your back. You want to make sure someone has your back. Okay? I don't hear that question.
Hello?
Oh,
Hello?
yes, I can hear you now.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Um, I think I kind of have a question, so I'll chime in here. We didn't get to hear from the other panelists as much, but I love that you touched the point of intersectionality. I guess I should be facing this way. It's a bit wonky over here. I want to look at you, but gotta
That's
look this
okay.
way.
You
So,
don't have to look at me. That's fine.
all right. So yes. So touching upon that and the idea of that safety and being brave, I think it's rising is a hard thing, especially for, as you mentioned, women. The idea first mentally that we can rise without sacrificing other parts of our life. Sometimes for Black women, they feel like they have to do everything and they have to do it all. And in many cases, it feels like we're failing in other domains when we do that. And I think I'm in that intersection where, you know, I've just left the youth, I guess, name tag, but I'm still trying to figure that out and balance that, you know, wanting to rise and knowing if I have the right to rise and feeling that guilt and shame and just that. And I see it with even young women who just carry everything and young Black women especially, we carry all the issues of our community on our backs. So I think, like, from that, I don't know if you can take out a question because I feel like I'm almost venting a little bit to you, but in a sense, maybe just giving us advice because I know this is something that is a collective issue.
You know, as a woman, as a Black woman, as a racialized woman, a woman with disabilities, queer women, you know, we're all dealing with those intersections. And every one of those layers makes it even more challenging for us to step up and speak up. But I use this term a lot. Find your voice. It took me a long time to find my voice, but I'm so grateful that I did. And when I found my voice, guess what? I realized that people would listen. And one of my former colleagues said that to me one day. She said, "You know, Wanda, you don't talk a lot, but when you do, people listen because they really want to hear what you have to say." So again, to the women who may be holding themselves back for whatever reason, remember that your voice matters. Find your voice and use it. If you have to write down every word of what you're prepared to say, do that. That's what I used to do in the beginning. I had every word written out because I was afraid I was going to make a mistake. But guess what? We learn from our mistakes. We grow from our mistakes. We grow from the lessons learned. That's why the ongoing critical reflection is so important as well. You want to reflect on what it is that transpired, but that's causing you anxiety or worry or frustration or whatever it is. So this is real. You know, I don't want to dismiss it. I want to recognize how real it is for people and how anxiety, you know, works in people's lives. But there's no way around it. You really have to work through it. Oh, I wish I was with you in person.
Thank you. And then maybe we'll just give a few more seconds to see if there's any other questions in the chat or anyone in the panel.
You know, I don't think I'll feel good about today if I don't hear a question from the two women on the panel, the two young women on the panel.
I agree. Trinity looks like.
I was just about ready to ask you something. So first off, I want to say thank you very much for being with us and discussing all this. You've given some very insightful information here. And I guess, so my question is because I am mixed, my mother is Caucasian and then my dad being Black. So I was primarily raised by my mother. So growing up, you know, I was always asked the question, well, what are you? Are you white? Are you Black? Why can't you make up your mind kind of deal? Or, why are you acting black? You're white, and vice versa, right? So I'd say just in the last 5 years after having my son, I've more or less been trying to embrace, my black side, quote unquote, more. So I guess I'm just wondering if you have any advice or suggestions for me on with raising my boys on how to embrace my background more, if that makes.
I think one of the things that's really important is being able to embrace all of who you are. You can't disown the white part of you. That's your mom, did you say?
Yes.
Yes. So, your mother is your mother. So you need to embrace all of who you are. But you can embrace all of who you are without losing any of who you are. Lawrence Hill wrote a book about this very thing. I think it's called The Blacker the Berry, the Sweeter the Juice. It's an old book. He wrote it years ago, but it's a fantastic book. I would encourage you to read it. I would encourage you to, as your son, I think you said you have 3 sons. As your sons get older, encourage them to read it and expose your son to, again, all parts of their history. You want people of mixed race go through a lot of challenges, not because of anything that's inside them, but because of the way society is treating you. So finding a way to challenge some of those structures and some of those systemic issues would be important too. But even having these conversations, that in itself is going to help bring about change.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking the question.
Thank you. And I believe we had a question in the chat from Sensetsa. One of the things that work against us is that we are at the mercy of the system. Many times by speaking out and being a positive disruptor is that we run the risk of losing the very source that puts food on our table. How do we overcome that fear and or risk?
So you remember one of the things I said earlier when I talked about positive disruption, I said, you don't want to do things to get yourself fired. And sometimes you don't have to do a lot to get yourself fired because, someone's ready to just pull the axe anyway. Finding supports. So if there's a union, unions can be a great sources of support. If there are other people who've worked in that place, I gave you the example. For me, in my early years in social work, it was really, really difficult. And the invitation to join the Association of Black Social Workers, even though there was only 4 of us, the 4 of us together made a lot of changes. And so none of us put our individual jobs at risk, but collectively, we were able to lead change. We were able to make policy changes, systems changes that we still see today that have not just continued, but have been made even better. And so how did we do that? We did that by coming together. So maybe, as an individual, you don't speak out in the organization, but maybe there's a way that you do that outside with supports.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. I might have to be cued if I'm running out of time, but from a question from Katrina, how have you navigated knowing whether or not people's negative treatment was based on race or personality? I've experienced this a few times. How do you approach that?
That's a difficult question. There are times that I was experiencing racism and in a workplace, and I went to a manager to speak about it. And the manager said, "Oh, I think this is just a personality problem between the 2 of you. Do you want to sit down and work it out?" And I said, absolutely not, because my analysis of it was that it was race and racism. So I think the important thing would be doing your own analysis of the situation. And when you experience racism, it's racism. If it's a personality thing, then you deal with it at that level. But 9.9 times out of 10 is not personality. It's race and racism. When you're dealing with a racialized person in a given situation, I haven't come across very many that have been personality issues. But I think sometimes we're afraid to name racism. And sometimes we're taught not to name racism. We're taught that naming racism well, someone used the term, oh, are you playing the race card again? And I remember an infamous conversation with the pastor from Hammonds Plains Church here in Nova Scotia, Pastor Leonard Anderson. He said, I don't play the race card, I live it. So, we don't have to play the race card. We live the race card. Racism is an everyday experience, whether we want it, whether we want to recognize it or name it or not. We don't play the race card. We don't have to. We live the race card.
Thank you. And I believe, Shelley, you want to
Thank
say
you.
something?
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. We appreciate you being with us this morning and taking your time to explain, and it's just wonderful. Thank you so much. I just have a comment. You had spoke about mentors, and sometimes we look outside of our circle, but sometimes we need to look in our circle and look at our elders, our grandparents, or aunties or uncles that are older who have gone through, and from them we can learn so much. I'm very fortunate. I have an aunt who's 104, and we celebrated her birthday this summer, and her cousin came up from the other side. Her cousin came up from Dallas, and she was 92, and just to sit in the room and listen to these women was just so inspiring. And I guess I just want to say that we can take the time to listen within our own community, within our own family. So thank you for making that point about finding a mentor. Thank you.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Shelley. A few years ago, I actually had a project with some young people, and I invited them to select someone from their community. This was a project in the East Preston community where I live. And they were each invited to have someone in their community that they would do a profile of. I still have those profiles. And many of them chose an elder in their families. Many chose grandparents. And they had to go and do an interview. And through that interview, they were able to just understand the person's life story a little bit more. But if you have a 104-year-old aunt who is able to still sit and talk with you, how amazing is that? You're very, very fortunate. Shelley, if I could ask you a question. You talked, in your opening remarks, you talked about I think you said there were 5 Black communities, 3 in Alberta and 1 in Saskatchewan. I got Brenton, Amber Valley. I missed the other 2.
Wildwood, Campsie.
How do you spell that? I'm sorry.
Campsie is Campsie.
Okay.
So it was known as Campsie in the early 1900s, but it's now known as Barrhead.
Barrhead?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to try to learn a bit more about those communities. Thank you.
Well, we'd be honored to have you out this way.
Oh, I'd love to. Yes.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple questions, then we'll wrap up. From Edward, how can we challenge the pragmatic racism that exists within older individuals in our family? Are there strategies you have when talking to older individuals to challenge the stereotypes ingrained in them?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one because I was raised to, have the utmost respect for elders. And it's sometimes difficult. And I've experienced racism from older white folks, not necessarily family members. And it's hard. Sometimes, you just sort of say, sometimes you just avoid certain conversations with them. How much is to be gained by challenging some of those individuals? I remember this conversation has reminded me of an experience I had where I was invited into a nursing home to do a talk on racism during Black History Month. When I arrived, the elders who were gathered to meet me, and they were all white, they thought I was there to perform, to sing and dance. And that's the stereotype, right? And my initial reaction was I just wanted to turn around and leave. But I knew I wasn't able to do that. And so I just very calmly responded. And I said, no, that's not why I'm here. In fact, I don't sing. I'm tone deaf. I don't sing, but I'm here to have a conversation with you about racism. And that's how I started the day, and actually ended up having quite a lovely conversation with them. But I think if I had reacted from my first reaction, they would have left, or they wouldn't have listened to anything I had to say. So I think using positive disruption with that may be helpful, maybe exposing them to some positive examples of Black people. It's hard when it's in your own family. That's all I can say. But I know a number of people who've lived with this, who've lived through this, and sometimes they just don't have those conversations.
Thank you. And then our last question will be from Halima. For young racialized women starting their careers, what advice can you give on being seen and being able to grow, even after proving one's merit?
Just recognizing that as racialized women, we do have to work 2 or 3 times as hard. So just recognizing that, having the conversations again, with your supervisors, trying to create opportunities with your supervisor, creating opportunities for mentorship. There's an article that I co-wrote with a couple of people called Concrete Ceilings. And if you like, if you send me an email, I can send you that article, because I think, or I can send you the reference. I think that article has some good suggestions in it from people who faced the concrete ceiling, what things help them to survive and grow in environments where they were expected to fail.
Okay, thank you. I quickly just want to plug in, since you mentioned the communities like Campsie and Wildwood, that in the Shiloh Baptist Church in the basement, there is a beautiful exhibition displaying a lot of information about these communities, and it's also accessible online in the Shiloh Center for Multicultural Roots booth. So you can also view that gallery virtually as well. So that being said, we thank you, Senator Bernard, and the panelists. There's something powerful about a dialogue, especially a multi-generational dialogue. So thank you so much for imparting your wisdom, giving us your time, and sharing the space with us and everyone else here.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your conference.